Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where we take you inside Scottish politics. Welcome if you're new here. I know some of you are, so thank you very much for finding us. Hope you're enjoying yourself so far. Plenty more to come. I'm Calum MacDonald, and also on the podcast, Geoff Aberdeen, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister Alex Salmond. Hello, Geoff.
Good morning.
And Andy McKeever, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Good morning, Calum. Good morning, Jeffrey.
It's lovely to have you both here. It's been a busy couple of weeks on the pod, and so today we are regrouping by taking some of your questions and comments and thoughts and all of that and discussing all of these. We've had loads over the last couple of weeks, so thank you so much for these. If you would like to WhatsApp us as you're listening along, then you can do, and we'll read them out on the next episode. The number is 0333 404 6507. Save that number and message us anytime. Or you can email hello@holyroodsources.com, or you can comment on the videos and things that we're posting. So we'll get to some of your questions in a sec, but I just want to go through some of the comments here and see what Geoff and Andy make of some of these. So there's been quite a few on independence, first of all. Somebody called Cookie on YouTube says, it's Indy for me, it's Indy for me. Indy yesers must unite, but the SNP is the only party that can negotiate a settlement to independence. Hold that thought. Bill says, hopefully the SNP will put Scottish independence as the number one issue at the 2026 election. Robbo says, with all the polls indicating the SNP is ahead and on target to get a clear majority at Holyrood, the question of coalition is just in the minds of we unionists. Never mind, you'll soon grow up to realise Indy is the only answer to Scotland's problems. And this one finally from Alan on YouTube says, when you see the SNP doing well in the polls and with no campaigning for independence done whatsoever, it makes me wonder, can you imagine what the polls would look like if the SNP were not pretending to want independence? And I just thought it was an interesting collection of comments because there's a clear sense, obviously it's not scientific, there's a clear sense that people are looking for something of an independent strategy, Geoff. And I do just wonder how Swinney, Forbes, the SNP, how they have to position themselves. What should they be more public with a strategy for independence? Because that was something of the undoing of Nicola Sturgeon, wasn't it? That her strategy didn't work and it was very loud and proud. So what does John Swinney need to do? How can he balance all of this?
Yeah, and it's something that we tried to tease out of both him and Kate Forbes during the podcast. Answer came there none in terms of revealing any potential strategy. But the point is that clearly, and by the comments that you've read out there, that there's a significant swathe of the population that's anxious for the SNP to come up with some sort of strategy. And there's obviously a significant swathe of the population that don't want them to do that. And that's John's balancing act that he has to try and navigate. Now, I don't think this was particularly relevant a few months ago because everyone was pricing in a Labour victory and therefore, independence is off the table. That has changed significantly. So he needs to get the government to be more competent and viewed as more competent. I think he's starting to make inroads there, but to Andy's kind of long-standing point, are things getting better on the ground? Now, we can maybe come on to that in a second. That has to be a focus of this. I've always believed that if the party's viewed as competent, then yes, the people will give them another shot and crack at it. Secondly, they need to try and explain to the voters that within the decision of Nicola Sturgeon to put it to the UK Supreme Court, that was rebuffed. That is a big roadblock for John Swinney. So I wonder if they're going to use the 2026 election, perhaps not on the basis of having a referendum, but asking people if they should have the right to choose. Now, there's two different things there, and that's really important. So if you campaigned at some level on the right to have that choice, an independent referendum going forward, and you are rewarded with a majority or a majority coalition of independents MSPs, then you turn around to Starmer and say, people have voted for us to have the right to choose, so let's get the negotiations going now on the ability to have that referendum. That might be something that they look at. I'm just spitballing here.
Totally.
I think it's going to be very, very challenging for him as we run into 2026 not to have something substantial to say. So I do agree with the callers there and the listeners there in terms of their frustration. But he has to balance that off by tackling the people's priorities right now, which is health, education, job security, disposable income, the things that they were elected to try and make better.
Well, at this point then, let me just bring in this question from Marion on WhatsApp. And by the way, feel free to send a voice note on WhatsApp. Your messages are great. Voice notes are even better than we can hear you. In any case, Marion messages saying, "Hi team, thank you so much for the podcast." She makes some nice comments about the podcast. I won't read those out. They're very self-congratulatory. On the point about life doesn't feel better yet for people under John Swinney and Kate Forbes, how long is the lead time between political change at Holyrood and change on the streets? So this builds on what Geoff was saying, and Andy, yeah, absolutely feeds into what you've been saying for a number of weeks, including to the First Minister and Deputy First Minister on this podcast. It's a good question, isn't it, from Marion? How long? How long does it take? If they've steadied things politically, when does that translate into something for every person in the country?
Well, I think that is, I guess, part of the... I mean, it's a strange time to say part of the problem that John Swinney and Kate Forbes have got, because at the moment they don't have too many problems if you look at the polls. But I think part of the longer-term problem they've got is that some of these issues will take a long time because, you know, the decline has been long. It has been a long-term decline, and it will take a long time to get out of it. So if you look at something like, say, our transport infrastructure, I mean, it is absolutely dismal, particularly our trunk road infrastructure, rail as well. But I mean, you know, very, very poor. You can't click your fingers and sort out the transport infrastructure. That's a long-term, you know, potentially multi-decade vision. So that sort of thing takes a long time. The health service will take the health service is going to take a very long time because it's been in decline for such a long time, and it can't be fixed by money. It can only be fixed by structural reform, and nobody's actually proposing any structural reform yet. So that takes a long time. Education's been declining for 10 to 15 years at least, maybe more, in our schools. And again, that's slightly shorter term because things could be done on that right now, but it will take longer than the 2 years which they'll have been in power for by the time the election rolls around. So I think one of the things that was mentioned, and listeners who heard the John Swinney Kate Forbes podcast may remember this. One thing that was mentioned is that come election time, I think they were hinting, and we probed a little bit as well, that they'll be going pretty heavy on vision in comparison to record, because the vision is very likely to look better than the record looks. The record will look, I guess, like they want it to look, in that they want to portray to the country that there are two very competent people who are in charge. And that's a good message. That is a good sell. I'm not diminishing how important that is, because it's very important. And you can see in the polls that has its impact.
Yeah.
But in terms of actual on-the-ground record, they just won't have much in that timescale because the problems are so deep that the solutions will also take a long time to work out.
Yeah, I mean, to answer it a slightly different way, we've all talked about how John and Kate steadied the ship. What we don't know is how much is that down to complete antipathy towards the new Labour government, and people just going, nah, you know, this is a Scottish election and I'm going to go back to the SNP, or whether it is indeed of the actions of John and Kate. Now, I think I would be warn them both against complacency. We've seen how quickly things can change. So they do need to come out. And to take Andy's point, yes, it's difficult to affect change in a short period of time. But if you're saying the right things and indicating through your actions that you understand the people's priorities, then that might be enough to see you through in the context of an unpopular Labour government if it stays that way at Westminster. What you mustn't do in their situation is overclaim. So John put up a good defence of the Scottish Government's record in terms of some areas that he thought that the government had achieved a lot. And that's absolutely legitimate and fair enough to do so. So you need to have your armoury there, but don't overclaim on the things where you know you've come up short. And I think there's an element of having to be transparent with the people and saying, this hasn't been as good as we wanted it to be. But if you're speaking to the priorities in your vision, as Andy puts it, that's a big thing. Now, you think, well, that's obvious, Geoff. Of course you should do that. I don't think that was the case with the SNP in recent years before John and Kate took office. I don't mean to cause any undue offence to anyone, but I think we were getting far too much carried away in niche issues, minor issues in the sense of people's priorities, and spending so much political capital on things that people in their living rooms at night going, what are they talking about? Why does this impact me? And I think we must get back to that core priorities of the people. If they do that and at least have something positive by way of a vision, that'll be their best chance instead of actually delivery on the ground, Sam.
Yeah. Do you know, it makes me think, Andy, go on, do you want to say something? Because I'm about to take us in a slightly different direction.
Well, no, I was only going to come back to one other thing that was mentioned in the first tranche of comments that Geoff answered. There is always, I understand, for people who are passionately in favour of independence, I understand that as soon as the SNP start to do better, there is this automatic correlation between that and let's go straight for independence. And there is this kind of presumption that there isn't a campaign for independence just now, which, I mean, I think there's always a campaign for independence, to be honest, by the SNP, but there's a presumption that there isn't a campaign just now. And if there was a campaign for independence, suddenly another 10 points would be put on. I doubt that logic, I have to be honest. I don't think that figures at all. I go back to actually when Nicola Sturgeon was in charge. Remember a variety of leaks that happened, whether accidental or not, about the strategy that they wouldn't really want another independence referendum until they were consistently polling at about 60% in the polls. I actually thought at the time, and I still think now, that's a pretty sensible sort of strategy. And the truth is, irrespective of the fact that John Swinney and Kate Forbes are doing well just now, I think they are still absolutely miles off any sort of certainty that they'll actually be in the box seat to win a referendum at this point. If I was a nationalist, knowing that this is probably the last, if they do get another referendum at some point, it's probably the last. You're not going to keep having them all the time. If I was a nationalist, I wouldn't want one anytime soon because there's no certainty whatsoever that there'll be a victory. And frankly, if one was held today, I would suspect there would still be another no vote. So, I mean, I think that they need to just be a little bit careful on that.
But that's the dilemma, is it? Because, isn't it? Because polling for independence is still so high, it's anywhere between 45 and 52% it was recently. The unionists can't take the gamble of offering a referendum because they'd be scared they'd lose it, quite frankly. And to be honest with you, when you get into the teeth of a referendum campaign in the context of let's be honest with you, people scunnered with the Tories after so many years and now scunnered seemingly with the Labour Party, I mean, I'd fancy the Yes campaign's chances in this context, quite frankly. I really would. And that's why.
Say that.
No, of course, but seriously, I mean, politically, the context could not be better in that sense, in terms of your opposition. Going back to my point, but the Scottish Government need to be viewed as competent and on the money. But I feel that's why this is just an absolute logjam, because there's no way UK government, Keir Starmer's going to say, I'm going to call their bluff. All right, okay, good luck with that, pal. As long as you're not coming up to campaign right now. Now, maybe all these things will change, but right now, that is why there is such a logjam in this issue.
I would also add just to this that there is something of a kind of sentimental consideration for people who were involved in the Yes campaign 10 years ago, 11 years ago, longer than that. And the supporters of it who enjoyed the buzz. There was a huge buzz. And in that run-up, obviously, to 2014, in the referendum campaign, it was what everyone was talking about every day. And so I think there's a nostalgia from Yes supporters for that feeling of this campaign needs to be on the streets every single day, making an impact for it to exist. And I think, Andy, your point is right, that obviously by the very existence of the SNP and other independent supporting parties, it's always there, but it just can't always be at that level. But it's almost like that's what people expect it to be at. But that's just not how it works.
And just there, I know you want to move on to a different bit, Calum, which is completely fair because I don't think we need to talk about independence too much right now. But I agree with Geoff. Okay, if I was a nationalist fighting a campaign right now for independence, I would fancy my chances as well. But I'd only fancy my chances if I put forward a campaign which showed people how they could be much more prosperous in an independent Scotland than they can be stuck in the UK. I mean, ultimately, the sort of people in the middle, the switchers who actually decide referendum campaigns and frankly decide elections, they vote where prosperity is. They vote for what's going to make them better off in their lives. And that is where, that's where the SNP had a chance in 2014 and frankly they blew it. And that's where they would have a chance again now. I'm just not that confident they would actually make that much better a job of it right now than they did back then.
Yeah, we blew it. We blew it. We had we had everyone from President Obama, bloody European Union, the Westminster establishment up against us, most of the media, and we fought a good rearguard action, may I just say, and transformed politics in this country ever since. So I don't know if that's your definition of blew it, but maybe when you're in government once, Andy, we can have a discussion after that. We'll talk about blowing it.
What was I saying about nostalgia?
That was a good defence. I thought you were a Tory, Geoff, but you sound like a nationalist there.
Do you know, a very quick anecdote, and I've told you this before, but I think it's always worth remembering. I got the bus, the number 14 to Greendykes bus from the bridges in Edinburgh on my way to Peffermill for football training. We're about 3 months out from the referendum. I sat next to these two kind of older ladies, I think they were of old age pension age, and they were chatting away about lender of last resort. And I thought, my word, we've really done something here, because this is ridiculous.
Lender of last resort. Oh my goodness. That's what I mean. And I think that is where independent supporters that's where their minds go when you talk about campaigning for independence. It's that. Anyway, thank you for your questions on this. This is good. I was going to say this sort of one of the thoughts on vision. I'm going to tie it to Donald Trump, and this actually is kind of inspired by somebody who got in touch the other day to the radio program, who said, "I really fundamentally disagree with what Trump's going to do. However, one thing you can't escape is that he makes American people feel optimistic about the next few years, that they're going to be better off, that they're going to be better served by politics, etc." And I thought that is absolutely correct. Whatever you make of his policies, that's fine. But he inspires this sense of optimism and vision, and we're going to do something about these problems. And I suppose it lets us chat a bit about the inauguration and Trump in general. And do you want to consider President Trump? Where are we? Day 3, really?
Well, I mean, the reason that Trump is there, and this is a broader point really about the rise of populism and sort of territorial nationalism throughout the world as a sort of counterbalance to globalization, basically, which is what it is. The reason that he's there is because what we like to think of as the mainstream centre has screwed up, right? So people do feel optimistic, and from the outside looking in, we look at it and go, why are you feeling optimistic about that guy being your president? But they feel optimistic because he tells them things are going to be better, and he gives them reasons why things are going to be better, and they don't have anything else to buy into. So you can't really blame them for buying into that. There is a sort of real fatalism, centrist politics all over Europe and all over the democratic world, actually. We can't do this, we can't do that, there's no money to do this, there's no money to do that, and we must adhere to this rule, and we must adhere to this rule, and you throw in wokery, and you throw in climate change, and you throw in migration, and it's not that hard and then you throw in somebody like Trump, who, love him or hate him, he almost unique ability to connect with the sort of people he needs to connect with. You can't take that away from him. The guy has electoral talents, and he's proven that now a couple of times. And, it's not that hard to see how that has happened. And frankly, we're now sitting here in the UK with Nigel Farage polling pretty good numbers, with Reform UK having beaten the Labour Party in a couple of polls only 6 months after the Labour Party win a landslide victory at Westminster. And we have to talk about these issues. We have to talk about Trump. We have to talk about Musk. We have to talk about all these things and try to, for those of us who don't particularly like that type of populist politics, and I'm one of them, it's not for me, we have to talk about how we can counterbalance that, because at the moment, for sort of free market liberals like me, the world is going against us. And I don't think that we're doing enough to battle it. And frankly, we're losing, you go back to ideas and optimism, we're losing the battle of ideas, people like me who believe in the things I believe in. We're losing the battle of ideas, and we're losing the battle to be the optimistic people that people want to vote for.
Yeah. Geoff, the inauguration of President Trump this week, I mean, a huge moment, obviously, goes without saying. What do you make of this idea that he offers something of a vision and optimism and hope for people?
Yeah, I mean, look, we've seen this movie before, and this is exactly what happened in the run-up to 2016 when he became president as well. I mean, make America great again, and I'm going to put more money in your pocket. I'm going to bring back manufacturing. I'm going to, stop illegal immigration invasions, as he put it, from over our border. I'm going to herald a golden age for America. And if you're a punter at home, right, sounds good to me, quite frankly. He's onto something there. And that's where I thought the Democrats got it so wrong. As we've said again in this podcast some months ago, was they were focusing on protecting the institutions of America, and justice, and the importance of respecting the outcomes of elections. All very important stuff, no doubt. But ultimately, people aren't voting on that. That's not what motivates them. They're going to go with the guy that's talking about all the things I said earlier. And so I thought what we saw in his inauguration is I fall from it. Whether he can deliver all this stuff, I think is questionable. I think he knows that. Let's take one example, right? I thought it was really funny. It was a small thing. We're going to rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, right? Now, you think about the politics of that for a second. I think you've got to give him credit, and his advisor credit, a lot more credit than perhaps they are given. Because, right, you can't do that unilaterally. I mean, he can do it for, I'm sure, institutions and call it the Gulf of America, but other countries have to be consulted. But he knows that. They know that. You have a bit of a rammy later on, and it's all about how he thinks America's great. I want to make America great, and that's going to be the Gulf. I can't believe I'm not allowed to do that. And then you play the blame game. And then you as the distraction, you play the blame game because for him, you need enemies. You always need enemies. If you can't do something, it's someone else's fault. And that's how we'll see just about every issue fought. If he's pledged to end the war in Ukraine, well, it was day one, now it's in 100 days. If he doesn't do that, it will be the fault of the European allies, or it'll be the fault of Putin, or it'll be the fault of Zelensky, whoever he chooses on that particular day. And that's how this thing will run. Now, this might sound like I'm being disparaging. I do not like that form of government. But clearly, he's tapped into what he recognises is what people want to hear. And I think there's lessons to be learned from that in our own politics. I wouldn't like to see it so flamboyantly, but I think there is positive vision for what we can do. I'd like to see more transparency about what we can't do, and take that to the people. And there has been far too much focus on issues that are, and I'm sorry to raise gender again, but there's been, a lot of analysis done on the American election, and it seems that was a core issue that put people off in terms of Kamala Harris's campaign, even though she didn't talk about it. But the opposition put the shtick on them that they were all. You see, we've got to understand what makes people motivated to vote for you at the ballot box. And I feel that that's kind of been a lost a lot, in particularly Scotland and the UK politics, and why we're seeing the rise of reform, as Andy's rightly said, and why we're seeing such scunner factor, I'm going to say it again, with the establishment.
But you're right irrespective of individual views on the gender recognition stuff, you're right to raise it, because it is the totemic example of why what Trump would call the coastal elites, we can call them whatever sort of elites we want, but it's a totemic example of why the political class has totally lost touch with what the ordinary person in the street wants and thinks. It's a classic example of that. So, it's right to raise it, and we can see the impact that it has. But this is, if we take it away from the gender thing and look at other examples, part of the problem with the establishment mainstream parties, not just in this country but everywhere, is that they're never able to admit that they were wrong. They never ever say that they've got something wrong. And if you don't admit that something isn't working well, you can hardly then give a vision for how to improve it. So we're too busy saying that everything is absolutely fine. Let's look at schools. Okay, we talked with the John Swinney, Kate Forbes podcast about schools. And I thought, actually, if you drilled into it, it was one of the weaker moments, I think, for John Swinney and Kate Forbes, because the defence for the school situation was we've got lots of new school buildings. And I said, well, that's fine, but what's going on inside them? Because all the international evidence is that we're really struggling in education. Now, we are really struggling in education. Our school education is really poor. It's going downhill. It's now average or worse compared to other countries. People are going to cotton on to that sort of thing, and at some point, somebody is going to give them a vision for how it can be better. And if that's not a mainstream, then who's it going to be? So we have to start admitting where we're getting things wrong and giving a bit of optimistic vision for how to make them better.
Yeah, let's say, I just want to, what you've just said was far more articulate than what I was trying to say before, and that's my point about providing a vision, but being honest and transparent about your shortcomings as well. So take schools. We have delivered X amount of new schools in our time in office, all over the country. We are proud of our achievements. We recognise that we've got a lot more to do in education, so that we've got students that are coming out of those schools and ready for, the industries of the future. I think there's just that element. I think people are ready to hear some of the hard truths, but coupled and aligned with a vision. And if you do that, you might successfully avoid having to go down the potential route of Trumpism. So, where it's just all, gregarious, American golden age, and who cares if I get it wrong, because I'm going to blame somebody else anyway. Sorry, but it's we've seen it before, and we can see it happening again. And look, Farage and Brexit's a great example. Our economy is on its uppers, And one of the key factors behind that is because of Brexit. We can see that, in terms of our growth rates, our productivity rates since we left the European Union. And yet, who's the party that's making the main charge? Nigel Farage. I mean, you couldn't buy this stuff. You couldn't write it. I mean, it's amazing when you think about it. And because, he's providing people with what he sees as big problems and I've got solutions, doesn't even matter whether that's right or wrong. But the established parties, as we put it, have to come up with a competing message to that because we know the result. We can see it in American politics, what happens if not.
Really interesting. This is good. I want to read a few more comments and then finish on a really interesting question from Sue as well. So let's consider these ones from YouTube. Anne says, I will never vote for, she says, Labour, as in Labour. They said they would look after the waspy woman. They shafted us. £49,000 I lost. Buzz says, Labour have taken some unpopular decisions since coming to power. So it's not surprising they're not flavour of the month right now. They inherited a total mess from the incompetent Tories. One can rightly complain that the decision to restrict entitlement to the winter fuel allowance was bungled, but frankly, in my opinion, it was essentially the right decision. Those who support reform should really open their eyes and examine what Reform UK stand for. And Andy on YouTube says, when we see Anna Sarwar voting for winter fuel allowance removal south of the border and supporting the payment north of it, we aren't fooled. Labour's a UK party with a UK unionist agenda that includes their Scottish branch office. Anna Sarwar can try and distance himself from it occasionally all he likes. It won't wash. So those are comments on our video which was considering a potential coalition beyond 2026. And this question from Sue on WhatsApp I think is really good. She enjoyed the episode considering whether Scottish Labour and the SNP would have to work together, would choose to work together beyond 2026. Sue says, that might put the referendum on independence on hold for the duration of the coalition, but would it result in some benefits from working together? Sue suggests it could be less confrontational, there'd be more consensus on issues like tackling poverty, improving the NHS, there might be more space between Scottish and Westminster Labour, Scottish Labour might rethink their stance on independence, or they might negotiate on further devolution on things like immigration policy, control of drugs policy. She says, I still can't really see it happening, given the current vibe between Swinney and Sarwar, not to mention how some hardened SNP voters might react. But I thought that was interesting. The benefits of working together for the SNP and Labour. I think actually one columnist reflecting on our poll did title it Better Together when they were considering whether it would be a good thing or not. Geoff, upsides to coalition. I mean, Sue's probably picked out quite a few good ones there, maybe less confrontational, but more consensus working.
Yeah, I mean, she makes some good points. I mean, Labour and SNP are going to go at each other hammer and tongs in the run-up to 2026. That's just politics. If we're in a situation post-election and the cards have fallen and reform have made a substantial, much more substantial than even the poll suggests now, inroads into Holyrood, and the Conservatives have performed okay, and there is a requirement for SNP Labour to come together in order to shut them out. I'm being very nice to Andy today, but I point to his comments last week with the international examples of this. Then all bets are off, and you could see potentially, okay, let's stop this kind of race to outdo each other. What do we agree on? What don't we agree on? Let's take forward what we agree on as priorities and see how we manage this. Only if needs must, I think. I still think it's hellish unlikely, not least because I think there's a lot of water under the bridge to go before we get to the election. I still want to see the reform vote materialise, and I still want to see the SNP's lead be consistent in this respect. I think complacency is the biggest enemy to John Swinney and Kate just now. I'm not saying they're being complacent, but any suggestion they can just shut up and crack on and everything will be okay on the night, don't fancy that. I just don't think that's right. I don't think that recognises what people are thinking and viewing, and they want more from the politicians just now. And not least because we've seen what's happened to Labour. I mean, I will criticise Andy here in the general election. Remember when he said, well, I just think Starmer should shut up. He doesn't need to say anything. He's good to come. And I was like, you need to come with clear, bold ideas about what you're going to do, because when you don't, we're seeing what happens. And I think that they do need to do that at the SNP. So I know Chris Musson, I've got a lot of respect for him, was suggesting that John should just shut up. He's won this thing. Don't agree with that analysis at all for those reasons.
Yeah, Chris Musson, associate editor at the Scottish Sun, by the way. Go on, Andy. What about upsides?
Just briefly,
coalition upsides?
Yeah, a lot of this was explored in, and listeners who haven't heard the Coalition episode from the weekend, all the details are on it, and we went into a bit more depth on that, including on the German situation and the Irish situation. I suppose the only thing I would add, I agree with Geoff, neither party is going to proactively want this, but then neither of the parties in Ireland or Germany proactively wanted it either. It's an after an election situation, it's not a before an election situation. Yeah. The only thing I would add that I think I didn't say last week during the podcast on it is that just bear in mind, it wouldn't be a major policy leap for either of the parties to come together. You know, you look at, if you take all branding and colours off the manifestos that both of these parties produce for May next year, you won't be able to tell whose is whose. These are both ultimately sort of soft left social democrat parties whose main dividing line is independence. It's not anything else on policy. So these are two very similar parties, and Anas Sarwar and John Swinney are two people who think very similarly about the ways of political life. So that's the only thing I would add to what I said last week.
Nice. On our YouTube channel right now, Councillor Thomas Kerr, who defected from the Scottish Conservatives to Reform UK, he tells us why, and also suggests that Russell Finlay, the Scottish Conservative leader, might feel more at home in Reform UK. And yes, you can watch Professor Sir John Curtis, who unpacks all of that polling that set the news agenda on fire over the last couple of weeks. John Curtis, in full, available for you on our YouTube channel. Geoff and Andy, thank you both. And thank you for your questions and comments. Wherever you're leaving them, we're reading them. If you'd like to WhatsApp us between now and next week with more questions and more comments, then please do. The number is 0333 404 6507, and we'll talk to you again soon.